Now, if I could invite everyone to step out of that conversation for a moment. We'll revisit that. We'll go in and out of this conversation about sort of checking where we're at, how are we feeling about this, what do we still need to know. But what we want to do for about the next hour, before we have some time to sort of refuel brains and bodies and spirits and that sort of thing, is to get really concrete around how does this thinking apply in my bit of the world. And we're going to focus on one of those concepts and only one of them. That's the idea of conditions. So for the next hour or so, we're going to work deeply around conditions in the context of Ahachi. And what does that mean? But to sort of bridge into that space, I'm going to invite Kip and Peter to come up and join Larry. And we'll do just a very short sort of 10 minutes look at how do these guys have been using this thinking to frame the work that they do in places that are very different from Ahachi. General Motors Holden, a community in Stamford, Connecticut, and I just noticed he must have ducked out a minute, so we'll equivocate for a second. Now, so these guys use this thinking, and I'm going to actually join the panel briefly and talk about how I use conditions in the work that I do. So we'll just sort of model that for 5 or 10 minutes to get a really clear understanding of what we mean when we talk about understanding conditions. And then we've got about an hour around the tables to actually get deeply into what are the kinds of conditions that we actually are thinking about that we have to deal with at a variety of scales when it comes to the work of Ahachi. So I'm going to ask Larry to just take us on a quick sort of 2-3 minutes deeply into the thinking behind that term conditions, and then we'll get some brief feedback from Peter and Kip and myself around that in practice, and then we'll get you guys to work on that question.
Thanks, man. Can I also invite Christopher up because of his learning, leading background? Yeah, you might need another chair when Kip comes back. Okay, so this is our base model. Remember when we got to the point in the presentation that we're looking at framing conditions. Now, a condition's in the dictionary. Who's got a definition for a condition? What, you're all educated people. What is man over the back?
A rule that governs something?
A rule that governs something? Yeah, it's a condition.
State of being.
A state of being. And that's the word I was looking for, state. It's the state of something. That's what it is. It's the state of something. So when we're asking what are the conditions, so what's the state? But we're not just asking it in terms of its linear localised sense, we're actually asking it the whole-sided sense. So, you know, it's a more complex view than what you'd actually normally see. So if we were to say that this, what we have here is a system on the slide here, you'd see that it's not just one element of the system. It's not just an economy, it's multiple. It's what we call nested system. So it's like a system inside a system. You just think about Ahachi. You know, think about the network that is Ahachi. What have you got? Students, their needs. You've got the needs of the staff. You've got teaching staff. You've got parents. There's a whole system inside a system there, inside Ahachi, even though we've corralled it down to that. So it's not just one thing, it's multiple things, if we look at it from a whole-sided perspective. And what we need to do is not necessarily be myopic in how we actually deal with it. We have to take what we call a 360-degree view. We have to be able to look around and see what's going on around us. So we need to sort of start with the global, and I think we've all had our ears pinned back on the global right now. Who's feeling that way? It's like, my God, overwhelm. But, you know, sometimes that's just the way it is, you know. Better to do it in a room here than do it 20 years from now when we've got no context for actually having this conversation. So overwhelm's okay right now. Confusion's okay. Perturbation, it's called. But we have to sort of address those global things. What are some of those global things we heard us talk about? Just give me a condition. Sea level rise. Another one. Disease. Population growth. Food shortage. So we've got this global perspective. Whilst, you know, it's important that we take that global perspective into account, absolutely important. What we're going to have our conversation be is in the context of those global conditions. Tell us what's going on at Ahachi. How does that impact us? we're going to only do it in 3 scales, because we can manage 3 scales. I mean, people do it in more than 3 scales, but we do it in 3 scales. We're going to look at, we call it the regional, but it's what we call the macro scale. So what we're saying is, well, there's the whole world out there. In here we have Ahachi, which is the corral. We've corralled it here to Ahachi. But there's some stuff that's close by where we have fairly tighter links than the rest of the world. That would be the universities, the government, the other things that are happening in that sort of sphere. If you're in Victoria, that's the region. Now, what's happening in Victoria that's important to us? Who's from Victoria? What are the things happening in Victoria that are important to you?
Leaving Saturday's events aside, of course, the violence against Indian students.
Violence against Indian students. What else?
Water.
Water. Big problem. Coming fire season. University enrolments. So you get a sense, the mega, the macro, let's bring it into the micro. That's what we're going to have the conversation about for an hour after these gentlemen have actually given their views on how it affected them from Holden. Dave's done a lot of work in conditions analysis. So you've got a guy locally who can do this stuff from a Perth perspective. Christopher and Kip. Now, Kip's done it at mega scale, from Boston down to New York. So, you get a sense that his micro is some people's mega. Okay? Now, what we're going to ask in those 3 scales is, what is immediate? What's going on now? What's happening? What's the state of play now? What's happening on the field right now? What we're also going to be aware of is that what's happening now isn't always the case. It's what's emergent. What's that little thing over there that you've heard a little signal, beep, like Principle 7. When I hear Principle 7, ASX Principle 7, I go, whoa, here we go. Something's happening. It's a weak signal of an emergent condition. And they're going to be really important to make a distinction between those. They're not absolutes either, because sometimes the blaringly obvious to you can be an absolute emergent condition for someone else. So you have to be mindful of that. Tough problems are hard to solve, hard to buy and hard to sell. So I'll throw to Peter and just ask him we're going to do this is going to be very quick because they're going to be around the tables so you can refer to them if you've got any questions. Just 2 minutes each on the conditions that you've heard in your organisation, dealing with doing the conditions analysis, and tell us about some of the conditions you've already heard from a Hachi's perspective. So, my experience in doing conditions is you've got to take into account this, and this. And I've heard you guys tell me the things you've told me. You need to take those into account in your conditions analysis. Okay, Peter.